In January 1196, Richard I of England signed a treaty at Louviers, settling a dispute over a stretch of land on the border of Normandy and French royal territory. Philip II of France had held a claim to the site, called Andeli, through the Archbishop of Rouen, who had granted him rights there in exchange for other land, and the treaty resolved the dispute by awarding Andeli to Richard. On paper, it was a quiet piece of diplomacy, the kind of border settlement that fills a page of chancery record and is never mentioned again. The agreement carried one specific condition attached to that award. Neither king was to fortify the site. For a treaty settling a river crossing between two kingdoms that had fought each other for most of the preceding decade, that clause was the whole point. Whoever held the high ground at Andeli controlled the water approach to Rouen, the seat of Norman government, and neither king wanted the other building a fortress there. Richard broke that condition. Within the same year the ink dried. Building began before 1196 was out, on ground he had just agreed, in writing, not to fortify, and there is no surviving record of him offering Philip an explanation for the reversal. What went up on that ground between 1196 and 1198 was not a single tower, but 3 separate fortified rings, each with its own wall and dry moat cut into the chalk, arranged so that a force breaking through the outer ring still faced 2 more complete fortifications before reaching the keep at the center. The building moved at a pace unusual for the period, when most stone castles of comparable size took a decade or more to finish. Surviving exchequer figures put the total cost at roughly £12,000, against about £7,000 spent on castle building across the whole of England during Richard's reign. In other words, one fortress on one river bend in Normandy cost the crown nearly double what it spent fortifying an entire kingdom, though the labor force behind that pace is described in the record only as large and simultaneous, not precisely counted by name or number. The design included early large-scale machicolations, projecting stone galleries, with openings in the floor for dropping objects straight down onto anyone working at the base of the wall, a defensive feature England had almost none of at the time. Whatever else can be said about the decision to break the treaty at Louviers, the fortress that decision produced was not a token gesture. It was the most expensive and most heavily engineered building project of Richard's reign. Richard did not live to find out whether the fortress would hold. In March 1199, at a minor siege in the Limousin, with no direct connection to Normandy or to Philip, he was struck in the shoulder by a crossbow bolt while inspecting the defenses of a castle that had nothing to do with the river crossing he had spent a fortune securing. The wound turned septic, and he died on the 6th of April, not quite 5 years after signing the treaty he broke to build the castle, and a little over a year after the castle above the Seine was actually finished. The man who had broken a treaty and spent nearly double his entire English building budget on a single river bend in Normandy would not be the one to find out whether either choice had been worth it. That question was about to become his brother's problem, and his brother did not inherit it with anything like Richard's standing, either with his own barons or with the king across the river. The treaty had been meant to hold off. None of that was visible yet from the walls of Château Gaillard in the autumn of 1203. The castle stood exactly as it had been built, 3 rings deep, its keep untested by anything more serious than routine inspection. The treaty that had been broken to build it was 7 years in the past. The king who broke it was 4 years dead. What was arriving below the cliff that September was not a test of whether the design worked. It was a test of whether the kingdom behind the design still held together. And by the time Philip's army finished setting up its lines, the honest answer to that second question had already started to look worse than the answer to the first. What John inherited within 3 years of his brother's death was a legal opening that Philip was quick to use, and quick in a way that suggests he had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity since the day the treaty was first broken back in 1196. Philip recognized a rival claim to Anjou, Maine, and terrain belonging to John's young nephew, Arthur of Brittany, in 1202, elevating a family succession dispute that had simmered quietly since Richard's death into a matter of formal feudal law, with consequences neither side could easily walk back. John, as Philip's vassal for his continental holdings, the same relationship of lord and tenant that bound every Norman baron to the French crown, in theory, even when it was ignored in practice, was summoned to Philip's court to answer for the dispute in person, the standard procedure by which such disagreements between a lord and his vassal were supposed to be settled. He did not appear. Whether out of calculation, distraction with troubles elsewhere in his scattered continental holdings, or simple miscalculation of how far Philip was actually willing to press the process, is not recorded and cannot be reconstructed from what survives. Under the feudal process, Philip's court applied in his absence. His continental fiefs, including the fortress his brother had bankrupted half a kingdom to build, were declared forfeit. It was a ruling John never recognized as legitimate, one issued unilaterally by Philip's own court, without John present to contest it or offer any defense, but it gave Philip something he had not had before, something no amount of military pressure alone could have manufactured. A legal pretext. Inside the same feudal framework, both kings nominally respected and had both invoked against each other for years, when it suited them, for taking Normandy by force of arms, rather than through treaty or negotiation. A war fought purely on the basis of conquest invited resistance from every baron who feared he might be next. A war fought on the basis of a feudal court's judgment, however one-sided, gave those same barons a reason, or at least an excuse, to stand aside. The distinction between the two kinds of loss mattered enormously to the barons watching from the sidelines. A king who loses a war of conquest has simply been outfought, a misfortune any lord might suffer and recover from. A king who loses a fief because a court he himself nominally answered to ruled against him has, in the eyes of his own vassals, been outmaneuvered on the very terms he claimed to respect. John was about to discover that the second kind of loss was considerably harder to recover from than the first, because it did not just cost him land, it cost him the argument for why his vassals owed him their continued loyalty in the first place, an argument he would need intact for everything that came next. It is worth noting what the ruling did not do. It did not put a single French soldier on Norman soil, did not move a single supply wagon toward the border, did not by itself change the balance of armed force between the two rivals in any immediate sense. What it changed was the story each side could tell about what came next. John could no longer credibly frame an invasion as pure aggression by a rival with no claim to make. Philip could now frame it, at least to his own barons and to any Norman lord weighing his options, as the enforcement of a lawful judgment against a vassal who had refused even to appear and answer for himself. That framing would matter more than any single battle in the months that followed. It is a pattern that recurs across the whole of this period. Whenever a feudal superior wanted to act against a powerful vassal without simply declaring open war outright, the court process gave the action a vocabulary of law rather than conquest, a distinction that mattered less to the soldiers who would eventually do the actual fighting than it did to the barons deciding, in the weeks and months before any fighting started, which side's version of events they were prepared to stand behind. The legal opening was compounded almost immediately by something far harder for John to manage or explain away to anyone still weighing which side to support. In August 1202, John's forces captured Arthur himself at the Battle of Mirabeau, a genuine and fast-moving tactical success that should, on its own, have strengthened John's hand considerably by removing his rival claimant from the field entirely and in one stroke. What happened to Arthur afterward became instead one of the most damaging open questions of John's entire reign, a question that would follow him for the rest of his time on the throne. He was imprisoned, moved between castles, under circumstances the surviving record does not fully account for at any single point, and by 1203 had disappeared from that record altogether, with no further mention of where he was held or in what condition. No body was ever produced, no trial was held, no formal accounting of his fate offered to the barons, whose loyalty John still badly needed to hold his continental territories together. Contemporary chroniclers, without direct knowledge of what actually happened inside John's custody, nonetheless recorded the working assumption spreading across Normandy and Brittany at the time that John had had his own nephew killed to remove a rival claimant permanently and quietly, though the surviving record cannot settle that question with certainty even now, centuries later. What is certain, regardless of what actually happened to Arthur in private, is the effect the disappearance had in public. By the autumn of 1203, roughly 10 of the most powerful baronial houses in Normandy had transferred their homage from John to Philip, a coalition significant enough on its own to weaken John's continental position regardless of what happened afterward at any single fortress on any single river. The defecting barons were not a uniform bloc acting on identical motives. Some held lands on both sides of the frontier and had spent years managing divided loyalties that the forfeiture ruling now forced them to resolve one way or the other. Others had personal grievances against John predating the crisis entirely, disputes over inheritance, wardship, or favor at court that Arthur's disappearance simply gave them a more presentable reason to act on. What united them was less a shared verdict on John's guilt than a shared judgment that his hold on Normandy was no longer strong enough to be worth the risk of standing with him against a French king who now had both a legal ruling and a growing army behind him. Philip, holding a feudal court ruling in one hand and a growing body of Norman baronial support in the other, turned his army toward the one obstacle still standing between his forces and the city of Rouen. It was the fortress Richard had built at almost twice the cost of every castle in England combined, on ground he had promised, in writing, never to fortify at all. Roger de Lacy had not been placed in command of Château Gaillard by accident either. He was among the more experienced Anglo-Norman commanders still loyal to John at a moment when loyalty itself had become the scarcest resource in the duchy, and entrusting him with the site was as much a statement of what John still had left to work with as it was a routine garrison assignment. Whatever else could be said about the crisis closing in around him, John had not left the fortress in careless hands. The absence of Arthur from the historical record after 1203 is itself part of the story, not merely a gap in it. Medieval chroniclers were not shy about reporting the deaths of the powerful when they had reliable information to report, and their silence here, replaced by rumor and assumption rather than confirmed fact, tells us as much about how thoroughly John's court controlled information about the prisoner as it does about what specifically happened to him. A ruler with nothing to hide had every incentive to produce an account, however unflattering, simply to end the speculation. None was ever produced, and the speculation did the damage a confirmed account, however grim, might have contained. 10 baronial houses did not defect on the same day, or even in the same month, and the exact sequence in which they turned is not preserved with the precision a modern audience might expect. What the record preserves clearly enough is the direction of the trend and its rough scale by the time Philip's army was ready to move, which was more than sufficient to tell any observer on either side of the frontier which way the political weather in Normandy had turned. The context behind that clause is worth pausing on before moving to what Richard did next. Treaties of this kind were common enough between Angevin and Capetian courts in these years. A running sequence of settlements, betrothals, and border adjustments meant to buy time between wars rather than end the underlying rivalry for good, and both kings had signed and broken agreements like it before. What made Louviers different was not the fact of the agreement, but the specificity of the restriction attached to it. Most border settlements of the period left fortification rights vague or silent, to be argued over later if the question ever actually arose. This one named the prohibition outright, which means both sides understood, at the moment of signing, precisely what was at stake if either broke it. Richard did not stumble into breaking an ambiguous term. He broke a clause both kings had gone out of their way to make unambiguous, and he did it fast enough that the diplomatic ink had barely finished drying on the parchment before the masons arrived on site. There is a version of this story where Richard simply misjudged the risk, or acted on bad advice from a castellan eager to build before anyone could object. The timing argues against it. Nothing about moving a labor force, securing masons, and beginning excavation on a chalk cliff happens by accident within a single year of signing away the right to do exactly that, and nothing about the scale of what followed reads like an improvisation somebody talked him into after the fact. A king who wanted deniability could have waited, could have let a season pass, could have let the treaty's ink cool before quietly starting work on something smaller and easier to explain away as routine maintenance of an existing structure. Richard did none of that. He built immediately, and he built enormous. Diplomacy of the period ran on documents like this one, parchment settlements that substituted for war when war was, for the moment, too costly or too uncertain for either side to want. The Treaty of Louviers was not unusual in being negotiated, or in being detailed, or even in being broken eventually, the way most such settlements eventually were. What set it apart was the speed of the breach relative to the signing, a gap measured in months rather than years, and the fact that the party breaking it was the party who had just been handed the disputed ground outright. Philip had lost the argument over who owned Andeli, and won, in effect, the argument over what Richard's word was worth once it stopped being convenient to keep. Whatever words passed between the two courts in the weeks after construction began, if any did, none of them survive. What survives instead is the wall itself, which said everything that needed saying about how seriously Richard intended to be taken. The tactical logic of the design deserves its own look, separate from the ledger of cost and pace already laid out. 3 independent rings meant 3 independent problems for any future attacker, each requiring its own siege engines, its own breach, and its own cost in time and men before the defenders sheltering at the center could even be reached, let alone dislodged. Cutting the dry moats straight into the chalk bedrock, rather than digging a softer ditch and letting it fill with water, traded speed of construction for permanence and depth, a choice that shaped how long the entire project would take before it shaped how well the finished walls would hold. The keep at the center was given its own deliberately awkward approach, forcing anyone who reached it to cross ground the defenders could still cover, even after the outer rings had fallen. None of these choices reads like improvisation. Each one assumes the outer defenses will eventually fail, and is built around buying the men inside as much time as engineering could manufacture when that day arrived, not around the hope that no attacker would ever come at all. Every one of these choices points in the same direction. This was a fortress designed by someone thinking several sieges ahead, planning for an enemy who would eventually have time, money, and patience of his own to spend against it. A design built only to impress, or to make a diplomatic statement without any real expectation of ever being tested, would not have bothered with bedrock excavation on this scale, would not have needed 3 fully independent rings, each capable of standing on its own. The physical record argues that whoever specified these details expected the walls to be used exactly as walls, not merely displayed as a monument to royal ambition. None of this was accidental or improvised as the work went on. A concentric plan on this scale had to be surveyed and laid out before the first course of stone was set. The relationship between each ring and the next, calculated in advance, so that defenders retreating from an outer wall would always have a clear line back to the next line of defense, rather than finding themselves trapped in the open ground between rings with nowhere left to retreat to. A design like that reflects planning done by someone who had either studied siege warfare closely himself or had access to men who had, and who intended the fortress to be more than a symbol standing on a cliff. By the last months of 1198, the arithmetic of the project looked like this: a broken treaty, signed and sealed by the same hand that broke it within the year. 3 rings of wall standing where none had stood 2 years before, cut into bedrock rather than merely piled on top of it, engineered by someone who expected the walls to be tested rather than merely admired. A bill nearly double what an entire kingdom had spent defending itself across an entire reign, raised through the same machinery that had recently squeezed a king's ransom out of parish churches and merchant strongboxes. And, for all of it, a fortress that had not yet been tested by a single day of siege, its value still entirely theoretical, resting on the assumption that Richard himself would be there to make use of what he had built, and to answer, if it ever came to that, for what he had spent. Every earlier decision in this story, the treaty, the broken clause, the design, the cost, had been made with Richard alive to see it through to whatever conclusion it was heading toward. A modern observer, used to thinking of medieval building projects as slow, generational undertakings, tends to read 2 years as fast without quite registering how fast. It meant felling and hauling timber for scaffolding and centering arches at the same pace masons were cutting and setting stone, provisioning a workforce large enough to run multiple phases of construction simultaneously through more than one winter, and coordinating all of it from wherever Richard's itinerant court happened to be at any given moment, since a king of his restless habits was rarely in one place for long. 2 years, in that light, was not merely fast. It was a sustained act of royal will applied without interruption. Richard's death closed one chapter of this story and opened another, and the second chapter had almost nothing to do with stone or chalk or exchequer rolls. It had to do with who was entitled to call the fortress his, and whether the rest of Normandy would agree. Succession in the Angevin lands had never been a settled matter of eldest son following father in an unbroken line, and Richard's own path to the throne, contested by his brothers and negotiated as much as inherited, was proof enough of that. John's claim was real, backed by Richard's own wishes as reported at his deathbed, and by the practical fact that John, unlike his young nephew, was a grown man, already positioned to act. But a claim that is real is not the same as a claim that is uncontested, and John was about to discover the difference between the two in a court he did not control. Every negotiated peace between Angevin and Capetian courts had eventually broken down into fresh fighting before, sometimes within a matter of months of being signed. Nothing about the arrangement Richard left behind gave John any special protection from that same pattern repeating itself, and John had rather less time to prepare for it, and rather less personal standing to draw on when it came than his brother had enjoyed at the height of his own reputation. None of that uncertainty was visible in 1199 itself. What was visible was a fortress standing complete on a cliff above the Seine, a treasury lighter by roughly 12,000 pounds, and a dead king whose brother now had to decide, with considerably less standing than Richard had carried into every argument of his own reign, whether either the wall or the debt behind it could be defended at all. The men who would soon be defending those walls had inherited a fortress. What they had not inherited was the certainty their builder once carried into every argument he ever won. Baronial homage in Normandy at this period was never a simple, permanent oath, sworn once and honored forever, regardless of circumstance. It was a working relationship, renewed in practice by a lord's ability to protect his vassals' interests, defend their lands, and provide a credible claim to authority they could stand behind without embarrassment. A ruling like the one Philip's court had just issued against John did not, by itself, force a single baron to change sides. What it did was hand every baron already uncertain about John's judgment a formal, legally dressed reason to make a change he might have been contemplating anyway. The forfeiture ruling was a lever, not a cause on its own. Whether it moved anyone would depend on what happened next, and what happened next did John no favors at all. Loyalty of this kind rarely broke all at once. It eroded first in private conversations between barons weighing their own exposure, then in small delays and half measures, when a lord's summons went out, and was answered late or answered thinly, long before it broke openly and publicly in a transfer of homage that could be dated and named. By the time such a transfer reached the written record, the actual decision behind it had usually been made months earlier, in private, for reasons a single ruling could only ever partially explain. A baron, weighing his options in 1202, was not simply asking whether John was guilty of anything. He was asking whether standing with John still made sense given everything else in the ledger. The strength of John's remaining allies, the size of Philip's growing coalition, the safety of his own lands if the war went badly, and the plain fact that a court ruling, however one-sided, gave him language he could use to explain a switch of sides to his own tenants and neighbors, without simply admitting he had judged the wind and moved with it. That private arithmetic, run separately behind a dozen different castle walls across Normandy, is what the autumn of 1203 would finally add up. Set side by side, the two halves of this act do not read as separate stories, so much as one long argument about the limits of stone. Richard had answered a diplomatic threat with a wall, at a cost that beggared the rest of his kingdom, and the wall had done exactly what walls do. It stood, unmoved, waiting. It could not answer a legal ruling issued in a court it had no gate onto. It could not answer the disappearance of a teenage prisoner in a cell hundreds of miles away. It could not answer 10 baronial houses quietly deciding, each for its own reasons, that the man who commanded the wall was no longer worth the risk of standing behind. Everything built into these walls, the broken treaty that cleared the ground, the money that raised them in 2 years instead of 10, the death that handed them to a less certain heir, the disappearance that cost that heir his barons, had already been spent before a single French soldier crossed into view below the cliff. What remained to be seen, as Philip's columns began their approach that September, was whether a design built to make every stage of an attack expensive could hold long enough for the political situation behind it to change again, the way it had changed so many times already in the 7 years since the treaty was first broken. Fortresses did not fight wars alone. They bought time for someone else to win them. And by the autumn of 1203, it was no longer obvious who that someone was going to be. That question, whether stone could outlast the collapse of loyalty around it, is the one this act leaves standing at its door. Philip's army arrived below Château Gaillard in late August 1203, and it did not arrive to simply sit and wait for the garrison to lose its nerve. Within days, his engineers had put swimmers into the Seine itself, working below the waterline to sabotage the river palisades and staked barriers the fortress relied on to block the water approach. The same stretch of river the Treaty of 1196 had once been fought over on paper rather than in the current. The record does not give an exact count of the men who did this work. describing them only as engineers and soldiers, but it is specific about what they accomplished. By September, Philip's forces had completed a double line of circumvallation around the entire site, one line of earthworks and palisade facing the fortress to contain the garrison, a second facing outward to protect the besiegers from any relief force John might send. This was not a hasty blockade thrown up to bottle in a frightened garrison. It was a methodical, engineered isolation of the entire promontory, water approach and land approach both, completed within weeks of the army's arrival, and it meant that whatever happened inside those walls from this point forward would happen without any realistic prospect of relief from outside. None of this required Philip to guess at the fortress's weaknesses. He had watched it rise from across the same border for 2 years while it was being built, had known its layout in general outline long before his own army ever marched toward it, and he brought an engineering response calibrated to exactly the kind of position he was facing, a fortress that depended on the river as much as on its walls, and that could be isolated on the water before it was ever challenged on the land. Sabotaging the palisades below the surface, where the garrison's own watchmen could not easily see the work being done, meant Philip's forces controlled the water approach before the defenders fully understood it was gone. The circumvallation that followed was not a single continuous wall, so much as a system, earthworks, and palisade running the full circuit of the promontory, manned in relays, built to withstand a relief force, trying to break in from outside, just as much as it was built to keep the garrison from breaking out. 2 different sieges were, in effect, happening at once from the moment that double line closed. The siege Philip's engineers would eventually run against the walls themselves, and the siege his circumvallation was already running, silently and immediately, against anyone still inside them. For the garrison watching this happen from the walls, the meaning was immediate, even before anyone tried to count what it meant in practical terms. There would be no relief column arriving unannounced from upriver. There would be no supply barge slipping past in the dark. Whatever Château Gaillard needed to survive the coming months, it already had, in whatever quantity was already stored behind its own walls, and nothing more was coming in from anywhere else. The lower town of Petit Andelys, the settlement clustered at the base of the cliff below the fortress proper, fell early in the siege, before the circumvallation was even finished sealing the rest of the site. Whatever population had lived and worked in that town, merchants, laborers, families who served the garrison and the traffic on the river, now had nowhere left to go but up, into the castle itself, alongside the soldiers who were supposed to be defending it rather than feeding it. The exact size of that population before the siege is not preserved in a form precise enough to state as a number, but the later record of how many people had to be expelled from inside the walls gives some sense of the scale involved, and it was not small. A fortress that had been designed, room by room and ring by ring, around the logistics of a garrison holding out against a besieging army, was now also, without any of that design accounting for it, sheltering an unknown number of civilians who had nowhere else in the district left standing to shelter in. There is no surviving account of how that fall happened in tactical detail, whether the lower town's own defenses simply could not hold against Philip's advance guard, or whether its population made the calculation early and abandoned it rather than risk being caught in the open once the main army arrived. What the record is clear about is the direction of the movement. People came up the hill, into the fortress, because the alternative was staying in a town that no longer offered any protection at all. A castle is, among other things, a piece of engineering built around a specific set of assumptions, a specific garrison, a specific set of supply calculations matched to that garrison's needs across an expected length of siege. Every one of those assumptions had just been quietly invalidated by an unplanned population arriving through the gates before the first line of circumvallation had even closed behind them. A defended town and a defended fortress are not the same proposition, and Petit Andelys, clustered along the riverbank rather than raised on a cliff behind three concentric rings, had never been the harder target between the two. Whoever made the decision to fall back rather than fight for the lower town, whether that decision belonged to a local commander, to instructions already given by Roger de Lacy in anticipation of exactly this outcome, or to no single decision at all, but simply the collapse of whatever thin defense the town could muster, the practical result was the same. The fortress above absorbed what the town below could no longer hold. Command of the garrison belonged to Roger de Lacy, 6th Baron of Pontefract and Constable of Chester, and the force he commanded numbered on the order of 300 men, roughly 40 knights, some 200 foot sergeants, and around 60 engineers and crossbowmen who handled the fortress's own siege equipment and its counterfire against anyone working the walls from outside. Other sources close to this period give slightly different totals, and the breakdown should not be read as the only figure the record contains, but the scale it describes is consistent with what a fortress of this size and importance would need to hold 3 independent rings against a determined siege. 300 fighting men was not a small garrison for the period. It was also, critically, a fixed number, calculated against a fixed and calculable quantity of stored food, in a fortress that had just taken on an unknown and uncalculated number of additional mouths from Petit Andelys, with no corresponding increase in what was stored to feed them. A force this size was itself a considerable commitment for the period. Men who had to be housed, armed, and fed on a continuous basis regardless of whether the siege lasted weeks or months, drawn presumably from Roger de Lacy's own retinue, and from whatever additional men John's administration could still muster and route into Normandy despite the baronial defections already thinning his available forces elsewhere. 40 knights, mounted and armored, represented the garrison's most expensive and most limited resource, men who could not simply be replaced if lost. 200-foot sergeants did the bulk of the physical work of holding 3 rings of wall, standing watches, manning gates, responding to whatever probing attacks Philip's forces mounted before the main siege equipment arrived. The 60 engineers and crossbowmen were the garrison's own answer to the machicolated galleries built into the design, the men who would actually use those projecting stone platforms once there was something worth dropping onto below them. Every one of these 300 men had a defined role calculated against a defined siege. None of that calculation had room in it for Petit Andelys. Whatever loyalty John could still command in Normandy by late 1203, after roughly 10 baronial houses had already gone over to Philip, It evidently still ran deep enough among this particular garrison to hold 300 armed men inside a fortress everyone involved understood was now completely cut off from relief. That loyalty, or perhaps simply the ordinary professional obligation of paid soldiers under a commander they trusted, was about to be tested by something no amount of courage or skill at arms could solve on its own. Roger de Lacy expelled approximately 1,000 non-combatants from Château Gaillard, people the record itself describes using that same term, useless mouths, sent out through the gates and toward the French lines, in the hope that Philip's forces would let them pass through to safety beyond the siege entirely. This first group was allowed through. Whatever became of these 1,000 people afterward, where they went, how many survived the winter beyond the siege lines, is not recorded, and nothing about their subsequent history beyond that single act of passage through French lines can be stated with any confidence. What can be stated is the decision itself. A garrison commander, faced with a fixed store of food and an unplanned civilian population, chose to send roughly 1,000 of them out into a winter siege landscape, rather than watch them starve alongside his soldiers inside the walls. And for this first group, the gamble that the besieging army would simply let them pass appears to have paid off. Sending 1,000 people out through your own gates, toward an enemy army, is not a decision any garrison commander makes lightly, and it is not a decision that guarantees anything. Roger de Lacy had no way of knowing, when he gave the order, whether Philip's forces would let this group pass, turn them back at the point of a sword, or simply cut them down where they stood in the open ground between the two armies. Every one of those outcomes had precedent in siege warfare of the period. What he was gambling was not abstract. It was 1,000 specific lives sent out into that uncertainty, against the near certainty that keeping them inside meant the grain store would run out faster, for everyone, soldiers included, than it otherwise would. The gamble paying off for this first group did not make it a smaller gamble. It made it, for reasons the record does not explain, a gamble that worked once. 1,000 people is not an abstraction either, even set against the 400 whose fate the record traces more fully. It is a column of families and individuals, large enough to have taken real time simply to walk out through the gates and across the ground toward the French lines, watched the entire way, presumably by soldiers on both sides who had no way of knowing in advance how this particular test of an enemy's restraint was going to end. The apparent success of that first expulsion did not hold. A further group, roughly 400 additional civilians, was expelled from the castle in the same effort to stretch the garrison's dwindling supplies, and this second group was refused passage by Philip's own forces. They were not let through, and they were not let back inside the walls they had just left. What the record documents is the result of that refusal, rather than a stated explanation for it. Roughly 400 people, the very young and the very old among them, by every reasonable expectation of who gets expelled first from a besieged fortress, were left trapped in the no man's land, between the castle walls and the French siege lines, unable to go forward into Philip's territory, and unable to go back into whatever food remained inside Château Gaillard. The sources do not give Philip's own reasoning for the refusal, and none is asserted here. What is documented is where these 400 people were left standing as the temperature began to drop through the autumn and into winter. Nowhere at all. It is worth sitting with the geography of that trap for a moment, because the phrase "no man's land" can flatten what it actually meant on the ground. This was not an abstract legal or political space. It was a specific stretch of open, exposed terrain between a fortress wall on one side and a besieging army's own lines on the other, terrain that existed in the first place precisely so that neither side had cover close enough to launch a surprise assault on the other. There was no settlement there, no standing structure large enough to shelter hundreds of people, nothing but whatever the land itself offered against wind, cold, and exposure through a Norman winter. 400 people, expelled from behind one set of walls and refused entry behind another, had nowhere to stand except exactly there. Winter in this part of Normandy did not arrive suddenly in a single hard frost. It came on gradually, through weeks of falling temperatures and shortening days, each one a little harder to survive without shelter than the one before it, which meant the 400 people trapped in that stretch of open ground were not facing a single crisis, but an accumulating one, each week narrowing their odds a little further than the week before. More than half of that trapped group died of exposure and starvation over approximately 3 months, through the depth of a winter siege that had, by this point, still not seen a single engine thrown against a single wall of the fortress itself. In February 1204, Philip arrived at the site in person and ordered the survivors fed and released. The record documents both facts in sequence, the refusal that trapped them, and the later order that freed the survivors, without settling the question either way for a modern listener. Philip's February order was not full mercy, that erases responsibility for the 3 months that preceded it. And it is not proof of some premeditated design to let hundreds die before intervening. The sources simply record what happened, in the order it happened: a refusal, a winter, more than half of roughly 400 people dead, and then, finally, an order to feed and release whoever remained. By the time that order came, the fortress that had cost nearly double an entire kingdom's building budget, engineered by a king who died before he ever saw it tested, had still not been touched by a single siege engine. Its walls were exactly as strong as they had been in September. More than 200 of the people who had sheltered beneath them, or been sent from them, were not. 3 months is a specific span worth holding on to. It is not a single catastrophic night of exposure. It is season after season of the same cold returning after every brief thaw, the same absence of food compounding day after day rather than resolving itself, the same 400 people, minus whoever had already died, waking to the same exposed ground each morning with nothing closer to rescue than the morning before. Death from exposure and starvation under those conditions is not instantaneous. It is gradual, uneven, and it does not spare the strong indefinitely once the weak among a trapped group have already gone. By the time Philip arrived in person that February, whatever he found in that stretch of ground between his own lines and the fortress walls was the accumulated result of a full season of exactly that kind of slow attrition, not a sudden crisis he happened to discover. Whether his arrival was prompted by reports reaching him, by simple proximity as his siege operations continued, or by some other consideration entirely, is not stated in the surviving account. What is stated is that he came, that he saw what 3 months had done, and that he ordered it stopped for whoever remained alive to benefit from the order. No single villain and no single moment of mercy can carry the full weight of what happened in that stretch of ground over that winter. A commander made a calculation to save his garrison. An opposing commander, or perhaps simply the ordinary friction of an army at war, refused a group of civilians safe passage. Cold and hunger did the rest, slowly, over 3 months, without needing anyone's further decision to keep doing their work. Then a king arrived, saw what had accumulated, and stopped it. Each step in that sequence has its own explanation, however incomplete the record leaves any of them. Together they add up to more than 200 people who did not survive a siege that, from a purely military standpoint, had not yet properly begun. Act 1 ended with a question left standing at the door of the fortress: whether stone alone could outlast the collapse of loyalty that had already cost John roughly 10 baronial houses before a single French soldier arrived. That question did not get answered by a battle. It got answered, first, by a siege that isolated the site so completely, on water and on land both, that whatever the answer turned out to be, it would have to be worked out entirely by the people already inside the walls when the circumvallation closed, without any outside help arriving to change the arithmetic. Philip's opening moves were not dramatic. They were methodical, and methodical was exactly what made them effective. What followed over the coming months would test that framing more literally than anyone watching from either side of the walls could have expected in September. Everything built into Château Gaillard in Act 1, the 3 concentric rings, the bedrock moats, the machicolated galleries, had been designed to answer a soldier's problem. How does a garrison survive an army trying to break in? None of it had been designed to answer a very different problem now sitting inside the same walls. How does a fortress feed everyone trapped behind them once the food a besieged garrison planned for has to stretch across bodies nobody planned for at all? Before a single siege engine fired a single stone, before a single breach opened in a single wall, this second problem was already the one deciding what would happen inside Château Gaillard over the coming winter. It starts with a simple question: who was actually inside these walls when the circumvallation closed? The men who designed the moats and the machicolations had thought carefully about how many attackers a single gallery could hold off, how long a ring could delay a besieging force, how the geometry of retreat would work if an outer wall fell. Nobody in that design process appears to have modeled how many extra people the granaries could stretch to feed, because that was never the problem 3 concentric rings of stone were built to solve. Answering it would decide, more than any single engine or mine that came later, how the rest of this siege was actually going to be remembered by the people who lived through it, if they lived through it at all. A fortress can be engineered against an army. It is much harder to engineer against its own granary running out ahead of schedule. The arithmetic here is not complicated, which is exactly what makes it brutal. A garrison commander in a besieged fortress has a fixed store of grain, meat, and whatever else has been laid in against a siege of uncertain length, and a fixed number of soldiers, that store was calculated to feed for that length of time. Every civilian sheltering inside the walls who is not contributing to the defense is, in the strict and merciless logic of siege supply, a mouth-consuming food a soldier might otherwise eat, without a corresponding sword or crossbow to show for it. Medieval commanders had a term for these people, cold and clinical even by the standards of the period: useless mouths. What Roger de Lacy did next with that term, and with the people it described, is the part of this siege that has outlasted almost every detail of the engineering that made the fortress famous in the first place. It is worth being precise about what this term did and did not mean in practice. It was not a judgment on any individual person's worth, and nothing in the record suggests Roger de Lacy or his officers viewed the civilians sheltering in the castle as worthless in any human sense. It was a category applied under extreme supply pressure to anyone who could not fight and could not otherwise contribute directly to the defense: the elderly, small children, the sick, and by extension whole families who would not be separated from them. In the coldest arithmetic of siege logistics, every one of those people consumed grain a sergeant or a crossbowman might otherwise eat, without adding a single sword, spear, or bolt to the defense in return. That arithmetic did not care about affection, obligation, or the ordinary bonds that had presumably tied many of these people to the garrison's own soldiers as neighbors, tenants, or kin. It cared only about how many days the grain store would last, against how many mouths were drawing from it. Nothing about that arithmetic was unique to Château Gaillard. It was standard practice across medieval siege warfare, documented at other sieges before and after this one, a grim but unremarkable feature of how besieged garrisons managed supply under pressure. What makes this particular instance worth dwelling on is not that it happened, it is how thoroughly it is documented, in enough sequential detail to trace exactly what was decided, when, and what followed from each decision in turn. Roger de Lacy did not invent this calculus. He inherited it, the way every besieged commander in this period inherited it, as one of the few tools available once a siege outlasted a garrison's ability to simply outfight the problem in front of it. It would be simple and wrong to treat what happened next as a single decision made once and then left alone. Expulsion under siege conditions of this period was rarely a one-time act. Commanders reassessed their supplies as a siege dragged on, and when a first reduction in mouths failed to solve the underlying math, or when the siege simply lasted longer than the first calculation had assumed it would, a second reduction followed. That is exactly the pattern the record shows at Château Gaillard, and the second round did not go the way the first one had. Whatever confidence the first expulsion's success had bought Roger de Lacy, whatever assumption it may have encouraged that Philip's forces would continue treating expelled civilians as a problem to be passed through, rather than a lever to be used, that assumption was about to be tested against a very different outcome. The garrison's food supply had not stopped shrinking simply because the first gamble worked. There is no third option in a no-man's land between two armies in winter. No shelter had been built there because no one had planned for anyone to live there. No food supply existed there because the entire point of expulsion from the garrison's side had been to remove people from food supplies rather than establish new ones. Whatever these 400 people had, whatever clothing, whatever stored provisions they had carried out through the gates, expecting to walk through French lines to safety within days, was now what they had to survive on indefinitely, in the open, through a season that had already begun turning cold by the time the second expulsion left the walls. Word of what had happened to the first group, allowed through without incident, had presumably reached the second group before they themselves walked out through the gates, which makes the refusal that met them harder to account for by any simple pattern of policy on Philip's side. Whatever calculation changed between the first passage and the second refusal, if any conscious calculation changed at all, rather than simply a different local commander making a different decision on a different day, does not survive in the record either. What survives is the outcome, stated plainly and without explanation. The way this period's chroniclers often recorded suffering, they had no framework or apparent inclination to interrogate further. Chroniclers of this period were not writing modern investigative history. They recorded outcomes, dates, and the broad strokes of decisions made by the powerful, and they were considerably less consistent about recording the reasoning, the debate, or the dissent that might have accompanied those decisions before they were made. A refusal like this one enters the record as a fact rather than a choice with a traceable author, which is itself a kind of erasure, whatever the original intention behind it might have been. That silence is itself worth naming as a gap in the story, rather than papering over it with invented certainty in either direction. It is tempting, looking back from a distance of centuries, to want the record to resolve the moral question this episode raises: whether Roger de Lacy was right to expel civilians he could not feed, whether Philip's refusal to let the second group pass was calculated cruelty or a battlefield decision made under pressures the record does not preserve, whether either man could have acted differently and still won the siege each was fighting to win. The sources available do not resolve that question, and inventing an answer they do not support would trade honest uncertainty for false comfort. What the sources do preserve, clearly enough to state without qualification, is what actually happened to the people caught in the gap between two armies making decisions neither one made primarily with those people's welfare in mind. That is not a small thing to know clearly, even without knowing everything else. It leaves room for honesty instead of a tidy verdict, which is itself the more faithful account of what centuries-old sources this incomplete can actually support. None of this happened because a wall failed. It happened while every wall Richard had built stood exactly where he had put it, untested, unbreached, doing precisely the job 3 concentric rings and a set of machicolated galleries were designed to do against an army that had not yet fired a single stone at them. The siege proper, the engines, the mining, the actual assault against the fortress's engineered defenses had not yet begun by February 1204. Everything recounted in this act happened in the gap the engineering never accounted for, the space between an army sealing a site and an army attacking it, where the deciding factor was not the thickness of a wall, but the size of a grain store, measured against the number of people standing behind the wall when the gates closed. What Philip's engineers would do to those walls once the actual siege began was still to come. What Winter and Expulsion had already done to the people trapped between the two armies could not be undone by anything that happened next. There is a version of this story that ends at the walls, that treats the siege of Château Gaillard purely as an engineering contest between Philip's siegecraft and Richard's design, decided by mines and engines and the eventual discovery of a weakness in stone. That version is not wrong about what happened next. It is simply incomplete about what had already happened before the engines ever arrived, and about who had already paid the price of this siege before either side had lost or gained a single foot of wall. The fortress's reputation, then and since, rests almost entirely on its engineering. The rings, the machicolations, the speed and cost of its construction. Its actual first casualties had nothing to do with any of that engineering succeeding or failing. They had to do with arithmetic, with grain stores and head counts, with a category of person a besieged garrison could not afford to keep, and a besieging army, for 3 months, declined to let go. Act 3 picks up where the engineering was always going to have to resume, with mines and machines brought to bear against walls that had, so far, done exactly what they were built to do. Philip's forces deployed a full complement of siege engines against the walls, mangonels and onagers throwing stones on a continuous rotation, and, in some accounts, a single large trebuchet known by the name Cabulus, reportedly capable of throwing stones weighing several hundred pounds apiece. The exact weight and dimensions of that engine are not verified beyond what secondary popular history sources report, and the figures should be read as reported rather than as precisely measured from a surviving primary engineering record, but the general picture the sources agree on is consistent. This was sustained, heavy, mechanical bombardment, not a token gesture meant to intimidate a garrison into surrender. Stone-throwing engines of this class, worked by patient repetition rather than single decisive blows, the same stretch of wall struck again and again over days and weeks until the masonry itself began to fail under cumulative stress rather than any single impact. It was the mechanical answer, finally arriving after a winter spent almost entirely on starvation and blockade, to the question the fortress's entire design had been built to survive: whether 3 concentric rings of engineered stone could actually withstand a determined siege army's full technical arsenal, brought to bear directly against them rather than left waiting outside a sealed perimeter. Assembling and positioning engines of this scale against a fortress on a cliff-top promontory was itself no small undertaking, requiring timber, skilled carpenters, and a stable firing position close enough to do damage, but far enough to survive the garrison's own counterfire from the machicolated galleries built into the design specifically to punish anyone working too close beneath the walls. Every stone thrown against the fortress that winter was itself the product of weeks of prior engineering labor on the French side, a mirror, in its own way, of the 2 years of labor Richard's builders had spent raising the walls those stones were now aimed at. None of this machinery could work in isolation from what had already happened over the preceding months. The same encirclement that had trapped and starved hundreds of civilians in the no-man's land was also the encirclement that let Philip's engineers work undisturbed, close enough to the walls to position their engines with precision, secure enough from any relief force to take the weeks needed to build them properly rather than rush the work. The siege's cruelty and the siege's engineering competence were not separate stories running side by side. They were the same isolation, doing two different kinds of work at once. A trebuchet, the scale the sources describe, whether or not its exact stone weight is verifiable beyond reported figures, represented a level of siege investment few besieging armies of the period could sustain for months on end. Philip evidently could, which is itself a fact worth noting, alongside the engine's name and reputation. The resources behind this siege were not a passing effort, but a sustained commitment of an entire kingdom's engineering and logistical capacity against a single fortress. In February 1204, French sappers dug a mine beneath the outer bailey wall, packing the excavated chamber with wooden props that, once fired, would burn through and let the tunnel roof, and the wall's own foundation resting on it, collapse under its own weight. When the props were fired and the mine gave way, it opened a breach in the outer wall, and French infantry fought their way through it into the outer bailey itself. The record documents the method and the outcome clearly: the mine, the collapse, the breach, the assault through it. It does not preserve an exact casualty count for this specific phase of fighting, and no such figure is claimed here. What can be said with confidence is that the first of the fortress's three engineered rings, the outermost, the first line an attacker had to cross under the design Richard's builders had laid out 7 years earlier, had fallen, not to a single overwhelming assault, but to the same patient, unglamorous engineering discipline that had built the wall it now brought down. Mining of this kind depended on a defender's blind spot, as much as on an attacker's engineering skill. A wall's builders could reinforce its face against bombardment, raise its height against escalade, cut a moat against direct approach, and still have no practical way to detect a tunnel being dug toward its foundation from a safe distance away, invisible until the digging was already well underway. Whatever watch the garrison kept against a direct assault, it evidently was not enough to catch what was happening beneath the ground they stood on. The men who dug this mine worked in conditions that leave almost nothing in the record beyond the bare outcome. A tunnel excavated close enough to the foundation to matter. Timber props holding the excavated chamber open long enough to be packed and fired, and then the collapse itself, sudden after weeks of invisible labor. Sapping of this kind was a specialized trade in medieval siege warfare, passed down through practical experience rather than any written engineering manual, and the men who practiced it worked closer to a defended wall, for longer, than almost anyone else in a besieging army's employ. Whether the garrison had any warning at all before the ground gave way is not recorded, and none is assumed here. What the outcome makes clear is that whatever warning there was, if any, was not enough to prevent the breach or to seal it once opened. French infantry moved through the gap while it was still fresh, before the defenders could organize a response steady enough to close it again. That the wall failed at the moment its builders had prepared for, if not the manner they might have expected, is itself a kind of grim vindication of the design's honesty about its own limits. The middle bailey did not fall to any siege engine, any mine, or any assault against its walls at all. A small party, associated in the sources with the name Roger Bogus, found a way into the middle bailey through a garderobe, a latrine chute, that served a chapel built into that section of the fortress, climbing up through the fortress's own sanitation drain rather than breaching a single course of the stone that had cost so much to raise. Once inside, this small party opened the gate from within, letting the rest of the besieging force in without their needing to fight through a defended wall at all. The sources vary on exactly how much credit for this belongs to Roger Bogus individually versus the small assault party working with him, and no claim is made here that he acted entirely alone. What the sources agree on is the method, and the method is the detail that has outlasted almost everything else about this phase of the siege in popular memory. A fortress engineered with 3 independent rings, bedrock moats, and machicolated galleries specifically designed to make every stage of an assault expensive, was opened from the inside through a drainage feature nobody building it seems to have considered a vulnerability worth engineering against. There is a particular kind of irony in a fortress falling this way that has kept the detail alive in popular retellings for 8 centuries, long after most people who could name the Cabulus trebuchet or recite the exact sequence of the mining operation have forgotten those details entirely. A design that accounted for concentric rings, bedrock moats, and machicolated galleries, capable of punishing anyone who came too close to the base of the wall, had, somewhere in its planning, simply not accounted for its own plumbing. Every fortress needs sanitation. Very few fortresses, it turns out, needed anyone to ask whether that sanitation could double as an entry point for an enemy small enough and determined enough to use it that way. Garderobes of this period typically emptied through a stone or timber chute running down the outside face of a wall or tower into a pit, moat, or, in a fortress built on a cliff, straight down the rock face below, a design detail present in essentially every substantial castle of the era, and rarely, if ever, treated as a meaningful point of vulnerability by the men who built them. It served the ordinary, unglamorous function every castle's sanitation had to serve, and nothing about its ordinary purpose would have marked it, to Richard's builders 7 years earlier, as a feature requiring the same defensive attention as a gate or a wall. That gap between the mundane and the exploitable is precisely what a small, determined party found a use for. Whether the defenders manning the Middle Bailey that night had any warning before the gate swung open from the inside is, again, not something the surviving record settles. What it settles is the outcome, a second ring, defended by men who had presumably redoubled their vigilance after watching the outer bailey fall, gave way not to force applied against it from outside, but to a door opened from within by hands that were never supposed to reach that side of it at all. That gap remains the detail most worth remembering about how this ring actually fell. Act 2 closed with Philip's engineers still idle and the fortress's walls untouched. Every death, so far a consequence of arithmetic rather than assault. That changed through the winter of 1203 into 1204. While the trapped civilians in the no man's land were living and dying through the months this account has already covered, Philip's forces were also, in parallel, doing the patient engineering work a siege of this scale required, building and positioning the machines that would eventually be turned directly against the walls Richard had spent nearly double an entire kingdom's building budget to raise. By February 1204, that work was far enough along that the fortress's design was finally about to be tested against the thing it had actually been built to survive. 2 full months of a Norman winter had passed since the circumvallation first closed, months spent entirely on isolation and starvation rather than a single direct assault against the walls themselves. Whatever the garrison inside had endured watching that winter play out among the trapped civilians outside, they had at least had the walls themselves for reassurance. 3 intact rings still standing, exactly as built, untested by anything more than distant preparation on the French side of the lines. That reassurance was about to run out. The garrison inside had spent that same winter watching their own supplies dwindle, in parallel with the engineering effort taking shape outside, aware, presumably, that whatever came next would arrive on Philip's timetable rather than theirs. Roger de Lacy's 300 men had held the walls, and the expulsions had bought what supply relief they could. Neither of those efforts could do anything to stop what was now being assembled on the other side of the circumvallation line. Bombardment alone, however sustained, rarely brings down a wall engineered the way Château Gaillard's outer ring had been engineered, cut into and founded on solid chalk bedrock rather than loose fill. Stone throwing weakened a wall's face over time, but the surer, older, and more patient method for actually opening a breach in fortification of this quality was the one siege engineers had relied on for centuries before any trebuchet was ever built, digging underneath it entirely and taking the wall's own weight to bring it down. Mining required something bombardment did not: proximity. Sappers had to dig close enough to the wall's foundation to undermine it directly, working in a narrow tunnel within range of anything the defenders above could drop, fire, or pour down on them if the digging was ever detected before the chamber was finished and fired. It was slow, dangerous, unglamorous work, invisible from a distance, in a way a trebuchet's throw never was, and it depended entirely on the defenders on the wall above not noticing what was happening beneath their own feet, until it was already too late to stop it. Château Gaillard's own design, cutting its moats directly into chalk bedrock rather than looser soil, had been a deliberate defense against exactly this threat, since tunneling through solid rock was far slower and far more detectable than tunneling through packed earth. That defense evidently slowed the work rather than stopped it. Bedrock bought time. It did not buy immunity. A garrison of 300 men, even with the machicolated galleries built specifically to punish anyone working too close to the base of the wall, could not watch every yard of ground around a promontory this size at every hour of every day, especially not after months of siege had already worn down whatever reserve of alertness the men on watch had carried into the winter. 1 ring down left 2. By the logic of the design itself, laid out in Act 1, this was exactly what the concentric plan was supposed to produce. An attacker, who had just spent weeks and considerable engineering effort taking the outermost wall, now faced an entirely separate problem in the middle bailey: its own wall, its own defenders, its own fresh calculation of time and cost before any further ground could be taken. That calculation, when it finally resolved in a way nobody who designed the fortress's defenses could have anticipated or engineered against. A besieging army that had just spent weeks digging beneath solid chalk to bring down a single wall, now faced, in theory, the same math again. Another ring, another moat, another set of defenders who had just watched their outer companions fall and had every reason to fight harder for the ground still behind them. In theory, the Middle Bailey should have cost Philip's forces something close to what the Outer Bailey had just cost them. It did not. Every ring taken should, by the design's own internal logic, have made the next one costlier still, not cheaper. That the Middle Bailey instead fell in a fraction of the time and effort the Outer Bailey had required is the detail that makes this month worth studying closely rather than treating as a single, predictable escalation. 2 of the fortress's 3 rings were down within the same month. One to patient, deliberate engineering that took weeks of digging and calculation to succeed. The other to an architectural oversight that took a handful of men and a working knowledge of where a chapel's drain actually led. The contrast between those 2 methods, one earned through the same kind of engineering discipline that had built the walls in the first place, the other exploiting a detail nobody building those walls seems to have thought to defend, would echo directly into how the fortress's final ring fell as well. For now, only the inner keep remained, standing on the highest ground of the promontory, the last of the 3 rings Richard's builders had raised 7 years earlier, still intact, still holding, while everything built around it to protect it had already given way by 2 entirely different routes in the space of a single month. Whatever confidence the garrison had carried through the winter, watching their walls hold against starvation and blockade while the civilians outside paid the price the fortress's design had never planned for, that confidence now had to reckon with a different kind of vulnerability entirely. Not a failure of stone or engineering, but a gap in the plan itself, the kind no amount of wall thickness or moat depth could have closed. The keep that remained was the last one, the one Richard's builders had placed deliberately behind 2 other rings, specifically so that whatever reached it would already be exhausted by everything it had taken to get there. Whether that final calculation would hold any better than the 2 rings that had just fallen was the only question left in this siege that still mattered. Act 4 opens exactly where this one leaves off, on the highest ground of the promontory, at the final ring of a design that had already been tested twice in 1 month and had already, twice, given ground. What remained inside that keep, and what it would take to finally bring the siege to its close, is where the story turns from engineering and infiltration to the last and most desperate phase of the entire campaign. Richard's builders had placed the keep last for a reason, believing, reasonably enough by the engineering standards of their own time, that anything reaching it would already have paid the full price the outer rings were designed to charge. 2 rings down in 1 month, by 2 entirely different routes, was not the test any of those builders had planned for. It was the only test that was actually going to matter. What that final test would demand of everyone still inside the keep, soldiers and whatever civilians remained, had not yet been written. It is worth pausing on how differently these 2 falls would be remembered if only one had happened. An outer bailey, taken by mining alone, would have entered the historical record as confirmation of the fortress's design working exactly as intended, expensive, methodical, costly to the attacker in time and labor, precisely what 3 concentric rings were engineered to guarantee. Add the Middle Bailey's fall by Latrine Chute, and the story changes entirely, not because the mining stopped mattering, but because it now sits beside a much stranger, much more human failure, the kind that undercuts any clean narrative of engineering triumph or engineering defeat. Real sieges, unlike the tidy version that survives in popular memory, are rarely won or lost by a single method. This one was won, in the space of 1 month, by 2 completely different ones. It also complicates any assumption that a fortress's reputation, built on the visible scale of its engineering, tells the full story of how defensible it actually was. Château Gaillard's fame rested, then and now, on its walls, its moats, its cost, its speed of construction. Its actual fall rested just as much on a detail so mundane that no chronicler describing the fortress's grandeur would have thought to mention it in the same breath. Popular retellings of this siege, then and now, have tended to favor the Latrine Chute precisely because of that irony, the satisfying narrative shape of an unbreakable fortress, undone by an overlooked drain rather than by force of arms. That preference for the memorable detail over the harder engineering achievement is understandable. It is also, on its own, an incomplete account of how this siege was actually won. Both the tunnel and the drain deserve their place in how this siege is remembered, and neither one, alone, tells the whole story of how a fortress this formidable actually came apart. There is also a simpler, more human way to hold both facts about this month together without letting one cancel the other out. Mining beneath a bedrock moat took engineering skill, patience, and men willing to work for weeks in a collapsible tunnel within range of anything the defenders above could drop on them if the digging was discovered too soon. Finding and using a latrine chute took a different kind of nerve entirely. The willingness of a small handful of men to climb through a fortress's own drainage system in the dark, uncertain what waited for them at the top, on the chance that it would open a gate the rest of the army could not open by force. Neither method was easy. Neither was guaranteed. Both, in the same month, worked. History remembers the drain more vividly than the tunnel, but the tunnel is what made the drain matter in the first place. Without the outer bailey already down, there would have been no middle bailey wall to approach at all, let alone a chapel garderobe behind it worth climbing through. Both belong equally in any honest account of how a fortress this expensive, this carefully engineered, and this thoroughly resourced by its besieger ultimately gave up 2 of its 3 rings inside 4 weeks. A siege this well documented rewards attention to both, rather than the flattering shortcut of picking a favorite. French sappers mined beneath the stone bridge connecting to the inner bailey, the same patient, unglamorous method that had already brought down the outer wall weeks earlier. This time, the garrison had a countermeasure ready, a defensive countermine, dug from inside to intercept the attacker's tunnel before it could finish its work undetected. It did not stop the breach. The original mine and the defensive countermine together weakened the structure enough between them that the wall gave way regardless, opening a breach the besieging force could exploit. What remained of the garrison at that point, roughly 20 knights and about 120 men-at-arms, a fraction of the 300 who had held the outer rings back in September, attempted to escape rather than make a last stand inside a keep that no longer had anywhere left to retreat to. They were caught. On the 6th of March, 1204, they surrendered. Mining under a stone bridge presented a different engineering challenge than mining under a standing wall founded directly on bedrock. A bridge structure carried its own load differently, and the garrison's decision to dig a countermine, rather than simply wait and hope, suggests they understood the threat well enough to attempt a direct engineering response to it. The first and only recorded instance in this siege of the defenders actively contesting an attacker's mine rather than absorbing its consequences after the fact. That the countermine failed to prevent the breach does not mean it accomplished nothing. It may well have slowed the collapse, bought hours or days the record does not specify, time that ultimately still ran out. Whatever the garrison's exact reasoning for choosing flight over a final defense inside the keep itself, the decision reflects something consistent with everything this siege had already demonstrated about how sieges of this scale actually resolved. Not through symbolic last stands preserved for posterity, but through hard calculations about what remained possible once every engineered advantage a design could offer had already been spent. The surrender terms themselves, whether the surviving garrison was ransomed, imprisoned, or simply released, are not detailed in the surviving account beyond the fact of the surrender itself, and no claim about their subsequent treatment is made here beyond what the record actually preserves. That, and no more than that, is what the record allows this account to say. Château Gaillard's fall did not end the war for Normandy. It removed the single obstacle that had been holding Philip's army back from the duchy's capital. Philip took Rouen on the 24th of June, 1204, less than 4 months after the fortress surrendered, and within months of that, all of Normandy was under French control. Roughly 150 years of Anglo-Norman rule, stretching back to William the Conqueror's own crossing of the Channel in 1066, ended within that single year. The record does not describe uniform resistance across every Norman town as Philip's forces advanced. Some contested the change of lordship, and some did not, and no claim of identical outcomes across the duchy is made here. What the record does support without qualification is the scale and speed of the collapse once the one fortress standing between Philip's army and Rouen was gone. A structure that had taken Richard 2 years and nearly double an entire kingdom's building budget to raise had held the entire weight of that outcome on its own 3 rings. And once those rings were down, there was nothing else standing between Philip and everything Richard had spent a reign defending. There is a particular kind of finality to how quickly the wider war concluded, once the single fortress blocking the route to Rouen was gone. 7 months of siege, expulsion, mining, and infiltration had been spent entirely on this one position, a position that had cost Richard nearly 2 years and a fortune to build, specifically because it commanded the water route to the duchy's capital. Once it fell, whatever resistance the rest of Normandy might have offered under different circumstances simply did not materialize on anything like the same scale. Rouen itself, the city the Treaty of 1196 had originally been signed to protect the approach to, opened to Philip within a season. The city the 1196 treaty had ultimately existed to protect, the seat of Norman government, the calibration opening of this account named directly, changed hands within the same year the fortress guarding its approach finally fell. Whatever strategic logic had justified breaking that treaty in the first place, whatever calculation had convinced Richard the risk to his word was worth the wall it bought, that calculation had run its full course by the summer of 1204. The wall had bought 7 months. It had not bought Rouen, and it had not bought Normandy. Nothing about the speed of that final collapse should be read as inevitability written into the outcome from the start. A different garrison commander, a different mine, a different decision at the Latrine Chute's chapel door, and this account might have had a different ending to report. It did not. What actually happened is the only version this account is responsible for telling, and what actually happened was fast, thorough, and, by the standards of 13th century territorial warfare, remarkably final. 150 years is not an abstraction either. It is generations of Norman families, English administrators, and cross-channel merchants who had grown up assuming the political arrangement joining England and Normandy under one crown was simply how the world worked, an arrangement that had outlasted multiple kings and multiple wars before finally ending within the span of a single campaigning season. The loss of Normandy weakened John's position with his own English baronage, the same class of men whose Norman counterparts had already begun abandoning him 2 years earlier once Arthur of Brittany disappeared and the forfeiture ruling gave them cover to switch sides. It contributed to the financial and political strain that, over the following decade, built toward the confrontation that culminated in Magna Carta in 1215. The loss of Normandy was not the sole cause of that confrontation, and no claim is made here that a single fortress or a single military defeat, by itself, forced English barons to corner their king at Runnymede 11 years later. It was one contributing factor among several, consistent with how the sources themselves frame it, but it was a substantial one. A king who had lost the ancestral duchy his dynasty was named for, who had spent heavily and repeatedly to try to win it back in the years that followed without success, entered the following decade with less standing, less continental revenue, and less unquestioned authority than any of his predecessors had carried into a dispute with their own barons. It is worth being precise about the shape of that contribution, rather than overstating it into a single clean cause and effect. Magna Carta emerged from a decade of accumulated grievances. John's taxation policy, his relations with the church, his handling of feudal rights and inheritances, and, running underneath all of it, the loss of continental territory that had once given the English crown resources and standing independent of what it could extract from its own barons at home. Losing Normandy did not by itself put a pen in John's hand at Runnymede. It removed a cushion that had, for generations before him, let Angevin kings absorb baronial friction without needing to negotiate quite so directly, quite so publicly, or quite so much on his baron's terms. John would spend much of the following decade trying, and repeatedly failing, to reverse what had happened in 1204, raising taxes for continental campaigns that never recovered the ancestral duchy, each failed effort adding fresh grievance to the pile his barons were already keeping. By 1215, the accumulated weight of that decade, taxation, without corresponding success, a king who could not deliver the one thing his position most needed him to deliver, met a baronage that had run out of patience for absorbing the cost of his failures, without extracting something in return. Magna Carta was the baron's answer to that accumulated weight, and Château Gaillard's fall sits near the beginning of the ledger that produced it, not as its sole entry but as an early and expensive one. The barons who gathered at Runnymede in 1215 were not thinking primarily about a fortress on a Norman clifftop when they forced John's hand. They were thinking about their own taxes, their own inheritances, their own standing before a king whose continental failures had made him more dependent on English resources than any of his predecessors had needed to be. That dependency traces backward, link by link, to a summer morning in 1204, when a wall that had cost more than a kingdom's own defenses finally gave way. 2 rings down in 1 month left the inner bailey, walls reportedly 12 feet thick, as the garrison's last position, the final ring Richard's builders had placed deliberately behind 2 others, specifically so that whatever reached it would already have paid the full price of getting there. By March 1204, everything that price had actually cost, the broken treaty, the 2 years of construction, the king who never saw it tested, the winter of expulsion and starvation, the mined outer wall, the drain that opened the middle bailey, had been paid. What remained was the narrowest and most literal test the fortress's design had left to offer. Could 12 feet of stone on the highest ground of the promontory hold where 2 rings already had not? Everything about the fortress's design had, from the very beginning of Act 1, pointed toward this moment as the true test. The concentric rings, the machicolated galleries, the bedrock moats, all of it had been calculated around the premise that an attacker reaching the innermost ring would already have been ground down by everything standing between him and it. That premise had held for 7 months of siege, in the sense that it took 7 months, mining, infiltration, and mass starvation among the civilian population outside, to get an attacking force to this final wall at all. Whether the wall itself would hold once that force finally arrived was the only question the design had left unanswered. 7 months had passed since Philip's engineers first sabotaged the river palisades below the waterline. In that time, the fortress had lost its lower town, absorbed and then expelled a civilian population it was never built to feed, watched roughly half of the expelled group die within sight of its own walls, and surrendered 2 of its 3 engineered rings within the same single month, one to patient mining and one to an overlooked drain. Whatever pride the garrison still carried into this final position, it carried it having already watched almost everything the design was supposed to guarantee fail to guarantee it. The garrison that surrendered that March morning was not the garrison that had watched Philip's army arrive the previous September. A fortress that had opened the siege with 300 armed men closed it with roughly 140, and the arithmetic of that reduction is worth sitting with for a moment before moving to what the surrender actually meant for the wider war. Some of that reduction was combat loss across the mining assaults and the fighting that followed each breach. Some of it, the record does not specify how much, may simply reflect a garrison worn down by 7 months of siege, disease, and the same grinding supply pressure that had already killed more than 200 civilians outside the walls before a single ring fell. Whatever the exact breakdown, The number left to surrender was less than half of what had started the fight. Medieval siege garrisons rarely surrendered simply because a wall came down. Surrender typically followed when a defending force judged further resistance to be hopeless rather than merely difficult, when the men still capable of fighting could see clearly enough that no relief was coming and no further defense would change the outcome, only extend the dying. Roger de Lacy's remaining 140 men had watched 2 rings fall in a single month, had watched a defensive countermine fail to stop a third, and had nowhere left inside the fortress to retreat to once the escape attempt itself was caught. Surrender, at that point, was not a failure of nerve. It was the only decision left that did not simply add more names to a death toll. The siege had already run up considerably, on both sides of the walls, over the preceding 7 months. A siege garrison making that calculation was not, in any meaningful sense, choosing dishonor over resistance. It was making the same kind of arithmetic judgment Roger de Lacy had already made once before, back in the autumn, when he sent 1,000 civilians out through the gates rather than watch them starve alongside his soldiers. Both decisions weighed a hard, immediate cost against a worse one still to come, and both reflect a command style oriented toward preserving whatever could still be preserved, rather than toward a symbolic gesture that would have cost more lives to accomplish nothing lasting. That same calculating instinct is worth naming plainly, rather than passing over. A commander who both sent civilians into uncertainty to save his garrison's food, and, months later, walked his surviving men into an escape attempt rather than a symbolic last stand, was consistently choosing whatever path kept the most people alive, under conditions that offered no path guaranteed to keep everyone alive at all. Losing Normandy was not, for John, simply a loss of territory abroad. Distant ground an island kingdom could shrug off and continue governing itself much as before. Normandy had been the beating administrative and financial heart of the Angevin world since before Richard was born, the duchy that had produced the very dynasty John belonged to. Its loss reached back across the Channel, into the politics of England itself, in ways that would take another decade to fully play out. It reached even further than John's own reign, into how the English crown related to its barons for generations afterward, though tracing that longer thread belongs to a different account than this one. What belongs here is the immediate, documented consequence. A king who returned from Normandy in 1204, returned to a baronage that had watched him lose, in less than a year, ground his family had held for a century and a half. Every prior baronial defection in this account, the roughly 10 Norman houses that transferred homage in 1203, had been a warning of exactly this dynamic playing out on the continental side of the Channel. What changed after 1204 was that the same erosion of confidence, the same calculation that standing with John carried more risk than reward, began working its way through the English baronage as well, on ground much closer to the crown's own seat of power. That reckoning was still 11 years away in 1204, but its first substantial debt had already been entered into the ledger. It is worth returning, at the end, to the treaty that started this account, because the shape of the whole story is set by how directly it connects back to that single broken clause. A king promised, in writing, not to fortify a stretch of riverbank. He broke that promise within the year and spent nearly double his kingdom's entire building budget, making sure the broken promise held anyway, in stone if not in diplomacy. He died before he ever saw whether the wall would work. His brother inherited the wall, along with a succession dispute the wall could do nothing to settle, lost the argument in a court he did not control, lost his nephew to a disappearance no one has ever fully explained, and lost roughly 10 baronial houses before a single enemy soldier arrived. The wall itself held for exactly as long as engineering could make it hold, which turned out to be a mined outer wall, a latrine chute nobody thought to defend, and a countermined inner bailey that gave way regardless. In between the broken promise and the final surrender, more than 200 civilians died in a stretch of open ground between two armies, neither one of which had built anything, engineered anything, or promised anything on their behalf. Dynasty and dust are not two separate halves of this story. They are the same story, told twice, once in the treaties, the successions, and the courts that decided who held the ground, and once in the actual stone, the actual grain stores, and the actual people who lived and died on that ground, while the first story was still being decided above their heads. The fortress that was supposed to hold a dynasty together ended 7 years after its first stone was cut, as the place where both stories closed at once. That is the accounting this account has tried to keep honestly across 4 acts, not the fortress alone, and not the dynasty alone, but both ledgers held open at once, because the sources allow it, and because neither ledger, read by itself, tells the truth of what actually happened at Château Gaillard, between one broken treaty and one final surrender. A castle can be measured in pounds spent, rings built, and months held. A siege can be measured in baronial defections, feudal rulings, and the collapse of 150 years of rule. And an account that only measures those 2 things has still left out the 400 people who were never soldiers, never barons, never party to any treaty, and who paid, in the most literal sense the word allows, the winter cost of a fight over a wall they had no part in building and no power to end. Richard is not present for any of this closing accounting. 4 years dead by the time the siege even began, and that absence is itself worth holding on to at the very end. Every decision that mattered most in this story, after the treaty was broken, whether to build a countermine, whether to expel 1,000 civilians, whether Philip's forces would let a group pass or refuse it, whether a small party would risk a chapel drain in the dark, belonged to people who inherited a wall rather than a choice. The wall was Richard's decision. Everything that happened around it, to it, and because of it, belonged to everyone who came after him, none of whom had agreed to the treaty, broken it, or built what replaced it, and all of whom had to live or die inside what one king's broken promise had left standing on a cliff above the Seine. There is a version of this account that would end at Rouen, with the political map redrawn and a kingdom's boundaries settled by force, where a treaty had once tried and failed to settle them by agreement. That version would be accurate as far as it goes. It would also skip past the people this account has already spent an entire act on. the roughly 400 civilians trapped between two armies through a winter neither commander was primarily trying to protect them from, more than half of whom did not live to see whichever flag ended up flying over the fortress that had, however briefly, sheltered them. Their deaths changed nothing about who eventually held Rouen. They are no less part of what this siege actually cost for that. Roger de Lacy, and his surviving garrison, at least, walked away from their surrender with their lives, recorded, named, remembered by title and number, in a way the expelled civilians never were. That asymmetry in the record, soldiers named and counted, civilians reduced to a round figure, and a fraction who survived it, is itself part of what this account has tried not to simply repeat without comment. It is not this account's place to assign that asymmetry a verdict 8 centuries after the fact, only to notice it plainly, the way the surviving sources themselves preserve it. A name and a rank for the men who fought, a round number and a fraction for the families who simply tried to survive a winter they had no part in starting. A number without a name is still a number worth stating plainly. Once more, at the end, more than 200 people, out of roughly 400 expelled and refused passage, did not survive that winter, in a siege whose walls, that same winter, remained completely intact. Naming that asymmetry does not correct it 8 centuries later. It at least refuses to extend it any further by leaving the number unspoken,